right. Did everybody have a good coffee break? Awake again? All right. I'm happy to introduce to you Fakir Bilal and Asad Iqbal, who are going to be talking to you about bringing discourse back to classrooms, rethinking online education. The talk will be about 30 to 35 minutes. There will be some time for a Q&A at the end. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause. Over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Fakir Bilal from Edley. I've got background in education technology and product management. I'm also one of the product core contributors for OpenEdX. Thank you for being here. Let's start with a quick thought experiment. So visualize a classroom that you might have been in where students and the instructor are having an engaging and interesting conversation about the topic. Think of adjectives that you could use to describe that situation. And so picture the conversation flowing naturally and different people are contributing. So yeah, I would love to get some adjectives or phrases that you would use to describe that experience from the student's perspective.
Just quickly, an introduction. My name is Asad Iqbal. I'm also with Edley, and my background is in learning design and product development. If you're willing to share those adjectives, I just wanted to let you know I might be writing them down just for our references. I think it's going to aid with the discussion as we go forward. So. Any other words that you can think of? Interesting. Okay.
Face-to-face.
Can you repeat it into the mic for the recording?
Sure, so face-to-face, interesting, and fun. Would love to get a couple of more adjectives or phrases on the board, please.
Engaging.
Engaging.
Surprising.
Surprising.
Am I allowed to say intimidating?
Yes.
Sure, yeah, why not? Intimidating.
But we all found boring. Or for the introverts.
Someone also said boring.
Yeah.
Too interactive.
Sorry, what's...
Too interactive. They're not each other.
Okay, so...
Overly interactive.
Dominating.
Sorry, what was that again?
Dominating.
Dominating, okay.
Okay. We have
So there's some awesome things that happen when you're in a classroom setting where people are exchanging ideas freely, you're learning from your peers, it's a conversation that's forcing you to question your own beliefs and knowledge about the topic, and it's helping you build knowledge collaboratively with other people, which is one of the best and most engaging ways to build knowledge. But what happens when you try to emulate that experience for an online discussion forum? Why is it that you don't get some of these awesome things that we talked about in an online discussion forum? So can you share some examples of what that tends to look like?
Absolutely. And before I do that, you're able to see on the screen, I think some of the adjectives that we heard, even the ones like intimidating, overly interactive, we do believe that there is a potential for learning hidden somewhere in those interactions as well. And we'll talk about that as well. But if you take a look here, I think contrary to some of the words that we heard, online discussion forums look more like that, right? So we'll read one of them. Let's say one of the student posts, I love bread. And somebody responds, Joe, I agree with you. I love bread too. I like the part when you said that you love bread. That's a great point, right? This is all too common for those of us that have worked in the K-12 settings, as well as for those of us that have worked in the higher education setting. Now, obviously, some of these are a little bit exaggerated, but we get the point, right? So really, the purpose of doing this thought experiment was that what we want to do is we want to make sure that what we're able to see in classroom settings, we should at least be able to replicate that, or the good parts of that, in online learning, especially after a lot of efforts and research and a lot of the tech advancements that we have at our disposal. So
so before we try to figure out what does it take to build some of those awesome things that we talked about to the online setting, let's define some terms. And so I do want to preface this by saying that some of these terms, when we're using them in our daily language, we usually just use them interchangeably, which is fine, obviously. But for the perspective of this discussion, we want to define them and then come up with a framework on how we can bring the things that we talked about to the online setting. So would love your input on this. So we'll start with defining two terms first. So dialogue and debate, again, two terms that are used interchangeably very frequently. Can you share some insights into what the difference might be between these two? So I'll help you out. So debate could be a little bit more competitive. You're trying to prove a point. You're trying to convince someone. And dialogue is more two-way. You're trying to understand each other's position. And then we've got two more terms, discourse and diatribe. Would anyone like to volunteer what the difference might be between those two? No worries. So why don't we check out... Oh.
Diatribe is more like a monologue?
Yeah, diatribe is like a monologue, so that would be just one person talking and sharing what they're feeling or what they're thinking. And so we can define them by sharing the purpose of each. So all of these are different forms of discussion. So for the purpose of discourse would be to deliver information. And again, we're talking about these terms the way they're usually defined in the field of education, not how we use them in our daily language. Dialogue would be to exchange information and build relationships. And diatribe is to express emotions, browbeat, so monologue, like we just mentioned. And debate, the purpose would be to win or convince the other side. There's also another way to look at this, and that's through this infographic adapted from David Angel's research. On the y-axis, we've got cooperative on the top and competitive at the bottom. And on the x-axis, we've got two-way on the right side and one-way on the left-hand side. So everything on the right side of the screen, those two quadrants, those are two-way types of discussion. So dialogue is going to be between two sides, and the same with debate. On the flip side, you've got discourse and diatribe. So per this model, they tend to be one-way. And then on the top, you've got more cooperative form of discussions, where we have discourse and dialogue, where you're trying to understand and explore ideas with each other. And on the bottom-hand side, we've got diatribe and debate, which are forms of trying to convince someone or just like expressing what you feel or what you think. And so these definitions are useful in helping us build a framework to improve the quality of online discussions. We also want to share some evidence from research on why discourse and discussion work when it comes to online learning. Not only does it work, it's transformational if you can get it right. And so we do want to start from what has already been found out about this topic. You might be surprised to know that online discussion forums, while they became mainstream maybe a couple of decades ago, but the research on this topic has been happening as far back as 1970, in some cases even before that. So just think about that. This is a topic that's being researched for almost 50 or 60 years at this point. And so one of the people, Michael Moore from Penn State University, was doing his PhD thesis on this, where one of the main takeaways that he had was that if you increase the distance between a student and a teacher, that's not just a geographical difference. You can also look at it from a pedagogical perspective. And so that's one of the findings of his research. And he's also one of the pioneers of distance learning. So a lot of what he learned, we are able to implement in Open edX, on edX, and all the different MOOC sites and distance learning sites that we have today. So he doesn't always get the credit, but a lot of the ideas that we use today, that we take for granted, came from his research. And so even as far back as that, there were some pedagogical considerations that were being considered to improve the quality of discussion that's happening in a remote setting. Even during the early days of the internet, when computers were new, and there were very few prestigious universities that were using this technology. And so there's a lot we can learn from that by looking at that history and that origin story. And so in this 50 or 60 years of research, there were some major benefits that were found to be associated with enabling learning via discourse. And so one of them is that they help development of higher order thinking skills, and they help nurture and develop critical thinking skills. It's also important to mention that discourse in learning is not a replacement for direct instruction. It's a way to complement it. And so there is a school of thought where it says that just being able to learn from each other in an interactive setting, that's the best way to learn. That might not be backed by research necessarily. So the best way to do it is to do it in a complementary way. As good as all of this is, there are also some limitations with the idea of using discourse. And there could be a lot of problems. We've just mentioned a couple. It can be time-consuming as an instructor to deliver learning by incorporating best practices from discourse-enabled learning. There could also be technical and logistical limitations. And so, for example, if you're using a software like OpenEdX, there could be some things that you aren't able to do to enable that kind of conversation that we were just talking about at the start. For discourse to be effective, it has to be a few things. It must be meaningful. And what that means is that it can't be surface level. You have to explore your ideas. You have to question your beliefs. And as an instructor, you can help do that for the learners and the students. It has to be sustained, so it can't be like a one-off or a short discussion. So to truly reap the benefits of discourse in online learning, you have to do it over a long period. So do a lot of it and do it on an ongoing basis. And it must also be aligned with cognitive functioning, which means that as a student at a certain level, it can't be more complicated than you're able to comprehend or in a way that exceeds your base knowledge. And it also can't be too, let's say, dumbed down. So it has to be optimized to the right level. So those are some ideas that this course needs to be able to do to be able to function well. And once you make it work, it can transform online learning. And so how do we do that? We'll talk about that next.
Awesome, thank you. Also, just a heads up, I'm going to be the annoying one in this talk, and I'm going to ask some of you, because this is a lot of, it's a culmination of a meta-analysis of sorts that we have conducted at EDLI, as well as many researchers around the world, looking at findings from research on discourse. So I want to spend maybe a minute or two more just to ask all of you in the room about any challenges or any of these benefits that you have experienced or seen firsthand, whether that is through your work in the classroom or on developing something on OpenEdX or any other platform that you use. So I'll start, for example, I think Bilal mentioned technical and logistical barriers. In many of the courses that I have designed as a learning designer, the concept of moderation. What does it mean to moderate a discussion? What purpose does moderation serve? How do you make sure that that moderation is done in a logistically sustainable way? Those are all of the questions and a lot more that we have dealt with. So there are many that we have experienced firsthand, but we've also conducted research on it. And I'm just curious to hear more from other people in the room, whether you're in higher education or corporate adult learning or K-12 settings or work with OpenEdX as a platform, if anyone would like to share. And it could be any of those, the benefits or the caveats or the limitations that you wondered about.
So just a couple of challenges I think that we've experienced in designing courses. First and foremost is designing good discussion prompts, things that are actually controversial or interesting or are going to have more than the "yes, I like bread" to response. So that's one thing I think is supporting our subject matter experts in developing those good prompts. And then I think another thing that can be tricky, and it sort of is a limitation of the logistics sometimes is, especially in self-paced courses, it's the timing. I think one of the reasons why discussions face-to-face work well is because you get that immediate reaction and feedback, whereas if I go in and I'm the first person to start this course and put a discussion prompt in there and then someone else doesn't join the course or doesn't add to that discussion for another week, I'm not going to go back. So I think that those are two of the things that we've dealt with and have had challenges with in the past.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I can confirm that I have heard those same challenges from so many other people, as well as our own experiences very similar. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else that wants to add?
Yeah, so I think in some of the things we've done in the past, we found that like the technology matters, but the technology, there's not one right technology. It depends on a group of users. And so for some people, a mailing list would be the format they prefer. Other people, it's a WhatsApp group. Other people, it's a forum. But then also small things like single sign-on this one thing we used was it made all the difference between people actually posting and people not posting.
Awesome. I love that one as well. Interestingly, both of those points are going to be part of the first one a little bit more, but the second one, we'll touch upon that. So again, thank you for sharing that. Anyone else before? Yes, please.
So this falls more under the benefits one. I did a similar, well, not a similar, but another literature review a couple months ago, and the prompt for the review was, what are the most effective interventions for at-risk learners? And one of the key findings in some of that literature review is that the discussions are one of the key areas where we can leverage to benefit at-risk learners if done correctly. And I think this is a wide area to explore further. Like, how can we build features in a way that enables us to identify the at-risk learners appropriately and then intervene where in the most effective way possible? And a lot of the studies are pointing more and more toward forums, discussions as one of the best ways to do that. So.
Awesome. Intervention, I think. And I think that point that you just mentioned, it's unfortunate that it's taking us that long to realize that, frankly. And I think, but yeah, that's a great point, especially in online learning. I feel like this is something that I think in a previous slide, or actually in this slide, but I'll mention a lot of the research from Michael Moore talks about that. So in that sense, I believe it is unfortunate that it has taken a long time for us to actually realize the importance of that. But yes, thank you again for sharing that. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And continuing some of the findings from that meta-analysis of sorts that we referred to, there are three key frameworks that emerge the top of the list. And these are the three key frameworks, that we believe we should keep in mind when working on discourse-enabled learning in any context. The first one is Community of Inquiry Framework, COI. I think everybody is or maybe familiar with what that framework is. Of course, there is a lot of critique. There is a lot of questioning of the efficacy of COI, as well as whether it is relevant in online learning, particularly in higher education, and those concerns are obviously there. But generally, we can agree that there are more benefits of the framework than there are drawbacks, right? So the version that you see on your screen is a slightly adapted version from the original work from Garrison, Anderson, and Nurture. I think it's, if I can point out, the only thing that we have sort of adapted is the fact that the teaching presence and the social presence and the cognitive presence, which we agree that all three must be present in classroom or in online setting, we believe that the intersections between all three of those, there is room for discourse. So it's not only the interaction between the social presence and the cognitive presence where there is opportunity for us to leverage discussions and interventions and discourse, but I believe that it's all three interactions where we can talk about how people, for example, so let's look at all of them one by one. So let's say between the teaching and the social presence, you hear something from your instructor, from the professor, something that the instructor sets up in the form of an activity, right? The activity is only applicable and it's only effective if there is an environment that supports the transfer, right? Similarly, between the cognitive and the teaching presence and the social and the cognitive presence, right? So I'm assuming that everybody in the room is familiar with COI framework, so I'm not going to get into the details of that, those intersections. But if you have any questions, I would be happy to do that, right? So that's the first framework that we want and encourage everybody to keep in mind. The second one is the stages of progressive discourse, right? So this is adapted from the research of Dr. Puntambiker, who talks about the fact that discourse does help with learning and knowledge building, but this is not a one and done thing. It is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to happen with one single interaction. So essentially the three stages or the three phases of progressive discourse building have to be there. So initially there must be a divergence in ideas, two people thinking about the same thing in two different ways, which generates the gradient in thinking. So you think this is the right thing, I think this is the right thing. Well, let's talk, right? Then there is collaborative knowledge building. This happens through back and forth exchange, again, like Bilal mentioned, in a sustained and a long-term way. And people look at the other person's ideas. You may agree with some, you may disagree with others, but still you're having that back and forth exchange, which leads to some collaborative knowledge building. And then once you have changed parts of your thinking about a particular topic, you integrate that into your own schemas and your understanding. You're like, you know what? Maybe I used to think about it, but I stand corrected, or I'm convinced, I'm sold, right? And so on. So this is just a very reductionist way to sort of visualize those stages of discourse, right? So divergence leads to collaborative knowledge building, which in turn leads to individual knowledge construction. And the final one, which is just a very heuristic way of looking at the domains of cognitive awareness. So we believe that in order for us to leverage discussion, we have to make sure that all discussions must encompass factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive domains, which essentially means that, actually, I'm just going to use an example to explain this point real quick. So if I am creating a classroom discussion, or whether it's in an online setting or whatever, and it's about, let's say, data analysis, just an introductory statistical analysis, and I want to teach my students about the importance of knowing how to calculate mean, medians, and modes. I want them to know that there are three different average structures, right? So I want them to know about what mean, median, and mode are, but I also want them to know how they work. So that's the conceptual domain. Like, what's the difference between mean and a mode, mean and median if they're both averages, but they're not the same conceptually. You have to know what they are. But I also need to tell them how to actually go about calculating or doing that analysis, right? So we dive into the procedural domain, and obviously the metacognitive domain, where we want people to know what they don't know. We want them to know how much they know about what they know and all of that stuff, right? So those are the three key frameworks which we want you to keep in mind, because they will help us with the issues that we wanted to talk about, right? So now that we all have talked about the importance of discourse, how it appears in online education and other places, as well as some of the findings from the research, why is it that we're not able to implement them, or I should say implement them with desired success levels? Well, there's four major issues that emerge from that meta-analysis. The first one is rigidity in structure. Most of the discussion forums or discussion spaces that exist in online courses are very rigid. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I just want to go through the other four. The second one is misplaced incentivization, just the focus being on something where we believe that should not be the focus. The third one being ineffective prompt design. I think somebody mentioned that, so we'll talk about that. And the fourth one being the interface itself, being unintuitive or just not supporting from a user experience perspective and others. There are other contributing factors. I do want to caveat that when we did our research, we did find about 9. The lack of purpose, perception of forced interaction was one that really topped from students, and ignorance of benefits. Students not knowing what they can learn, and they just feel, but we're not covering that in this talk because they are more learner focused, and there's very little that we as educators and education practitioners can do, right? So the first one, online discussion forums are very rigid. We all know that, right? If you take a course on edX or any other platform, because we're talking about MOOC settings right now, particularly, we feel that typically there's a place, usually at the beginning of the course, introduce yourself, tell us about where you're from and all of that. Then maybe at the end of week 1, module 1, 2, you'll have another discussion forum, and people are expected to engage with the discussion space right where that is embedded within your course experience or your learning journey. As well as the format is pre-decided by the instructor about what kind of interaction, what kind of discussion you want to have, right? That is fundamentally it contradicts with how humans behave, how humans learn, right? Learners naturally seek dynamic and flexible interactions as opposed to rigid ones. It's very unlikely that if somebody tells me that at whatever time, at whatever space, I want you to have this conversation, it's just not going to work, right? So that's the point here. And these rigid structures, they limit creativity and they reduce student participation and engagement. So how do we go about addressing that? Again, no credit to us. We're just sharing the summary of the findings from that meta-analysis. The first thing is provide organic opportunities and provide many opportunities. Throughout any learning experience, there have to be multiple opportunities for students to interact, and they need to be weaved in throughout the learning journey in a way that it helps you decide when it is the right time for you to interact and not driven by the instructor. So that's the first point. The second one is encouraging flexibility, promoting spontaneity, integrating advanced organizers. We'll talk about that one just a little bit, and then also avoiding policing, right? So refraining from overly monitoring or controlling the discussion to allow freedom of expression. That was another thing that came. And allowing very easy and free navigation to access discussion. So within this list, again, I think many of them are self-explanatory, but integrating advanced organizers. So at Edley, we are working right now on a next block that is, we're calling it AO, Advanced Organizers, for lack of a better term. Can I just quickly ask if anybody in the room is from the higher education space? Okay, have you heard of advanced organizers, or have you used advanced organizers in classroom practices if you are in the, yes? Okay.
Could also be called e-portfolios.
Yeah, similar ideas, e-portfolios are there, other LMSs have some versions of them, reflection journals or learning journals, e-portfolios, but advanced organizers specifically, there's very interesting research that tells us that learners are not always readily available to interact because there is a fear of being judged in the online space, because whatever you write becomes part of your footprint, right? It's there, somebody's going to read it, you're going to be evaluated on it. But if you provide students with an opportunity and empower them to note down their thoughts and ideas in sorry about that, then they're more likely to actually interact. So again, if you haven't, look into advanced organizers as a great starting point because they empower students and the results that we have observed are very promising. Next, we're gonna move on to misplaced incentivization. We talked about that, so I'll skim through that quickly. Online discussion forums, unfortunately, tend to focus so much on metrics that should not be focused on. Word count, length, frequency of how many times. I have seen so many times, in different courses, you must interact with 3 out of 5 discussion forums. The length of a discussion prompt or post must be 250 words or characters or whatever, right? So it's not the quality of contributions that's being rewarded. So the outcome of that is that students prioritize meeting quantitative requirements over the qualitative ones, and they don't engage meaningfully with the content. So how do we go about addressing that? Well, clearly communicate the importance of quality contributions. As a professor, as a teacher, as an instructional designer, that's something that we should always keep in mind. We should evaluate relevance of the posts and not, again, the quantity, providing examples, encouraging depth. So again, going back to the factual, conceptual, procedural framework, feedback mechanisms that are timely and targeted, and rewarding quality over quantity, obviously, is very self-explanatory. The third one is the ineffective prompt design. Poorly designed prompts can lead to superficial and off-topic discussions. It's very simple, garbage in, garbage out. I apologize, but it's the truth, right? We have to get better at designing discussion prompts. Specificity balance is very important. Prompts should not be overly specific. They should not be overly generic. Well, if it's overly specific, you're limiting the student in terms of what they can share. But if they're overly generic, you're not providing enough scaffolding. You're not providing enough structure to that discussion. So what's that balance? Obviously, there's no secret sauce. There's no universal, size. But obviously, that comes from experience. That comes from experimenting. And obviously, alignment with learning outcomes and contextualized to real-world applications. Those are also important. So open-ended prompts, addressing multiple cognitive awareness domains, real-world relevance. Those are some of the, so again, we use a checklist of sorts. Again, it's probably not apt to call it a checklist, but just something when it comes to prompt design, those are things that are not negotiable. They have to be there when we design those prompts. They're not negotiable. They're not optional, right? So, and then obviously, providing context to students within the prompt is extremely important. Again, from that research, we find that if the context is provided within the prompt, you're reducing the barrier between, I think, again, it was you, or I think it was somebody else here, I forgot, I'm sorry. If you see a discussion post, you're not going to go back to it if it was, right? So if there is sufficient context, regardless of how long ago the discussion was posted, the context serves as kind of like a encourager itself, right? So that's important. And obviously iteratively improve, continuously refine, ask questions, and so on. Lastly, the unintuitive interface, right? So that we know can hinder student participation. It's the basic user experience thing. I don't think anybody in the room would disagree with that. And these interface-related issues, again, when we summarized the data from the research, there were many categories that emerged. So the best we could do was to just list them. Accessibility is one, navigation simplicity is the second, technical barriers and user feedback. Those are the four categories that come out at the top. So one of the things we did at Edley is we worked on the discussions. We introduced categories, and I'm not sure if we have time or the availability to show something, but we developed some user experience modifications and enhancements to the Open edX discussion forum for internal uses for some of our clients and partners and internal use cases. And we introduced categories such as questions, challenges, polls, discussions, praise, kudos, as well as just sort of mimicking the social behavior. Again, there is a lot of improvement, you probably know, in discussions compared to a couple years ago. But sometimes we felt the feedback that we heard from students was that, remember those screenshots that we showed? If you wanted to, if you don't have anything to add to somebody's discussion post and you just want to praise them for what they've posted, maybe there's a simpler way to do that. You don't have to write 250 words to just repeat what they've written and just come up with, nice sounding words to say, I agree, I love that you love bread. My brother also loves bread. Yes, we all love bread. No, that's just not how things happen, and we should not be encouraging that. We should not be rewarding that. So praise, kudos, shout outs, there's a quicker way to do that. But if you have something meaningful to contribute, then we welcome and encourage you to come and talk and add and post. So that's just one example that I wanted to share and the benefits that we saw from introducing those categories, right? And this is not an exhaustive list of categories. There is continuous research that we're doing at Edley, and we continue to invite feedback from everybody on that. So I'm going to pause there. It's 14 minutes and 45 seconds remaining, so I think we're on time. Actually, 1 minute sooner. So any questions, any thoughts, ideas on what we've talked about? We welcome that. Again, we continue to do research at Edley to make sure that whatever we have in terms of those is evidence-driven, and that's why we really value perspectives that you have seen, because we operate in different contexts and different sectors and different industries, but at the end of the day, people like you may have experienced things that may have been overlooked. So I really, really wanted to spend some time and ask people in the room about your experiences. Any questions? Bilal, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and if after the talk you're interested in receiving a more fuller summary of our findings, please just reach out and we'll be happy to share it on email.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Just a quick question for you in relation to, as you think about the requirements for creative and engaging discourse, how do you align that with the accreditation requirements, particularly in the US for RSI, which is regular and substantive interaction?
Sorry, did you say, if you could just repeat the question?
The question is, how do you align the best practices you talk
Yep.
about in relation to RSI in accreditation requirement documents?
Yes, so I think there's two components primarily. One is for RSI compliance, I think one would be alignment from the platform perspective. The other would be from like the actual discussion that happens, correct? So I believe that there's a focus that needs to be placed on the sort of making the system available, the ecosystem available, and then I believe the second part would follow suit, because right now the challenge that we have is RSI compliance or other quality metrics that we have. It's about how discussion happens, at least this is how I understand, and not so much about how we can improve that, right? So I think the best thing that I can say is to continue to look and research how that alignment can be met. But before that, we need to talk about enabling the ecosystem that allows us to get there. So I feel like it's a two-step process, and we can't talk about that alignment if we don't have an ecosystem for us to actually test it and for us to do that research. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering if you did A/B test on specific prompts or having the presence and absence, and then if you did, do you have that published somewhere that's publicly available?
So that's a good question. We did a pilot. Unfortunately, it's not something that is in a publishable state right now, because we really want to expand that and respect research and quantitative analysis protocols before we do that. So again, at a pilot stage, our goal was to see initial sort of something that points us in some direction, and for us to be able to expand that and scale that effort. But that is definitely something that we are interested in. Maybe Bilal can add more to it. It's something that we definitely want to do and do it at scale, because again, the sample sizes that we have, again, they're limited. I don't think there is enough triangulation for us to be able to publish that data, because it may not represent anything that's statistically significant, and we don't feel that it would be ethically we don't believe that it represents a large enough sample. That's why. But yes, if you want, we can obviously share something with you separately. For us to be able to publish that, I think there is a couple of more steps that we want to. Maybe if the conference happened in December, we would have something. But yeah, that's where we're at
thank
right
you.
now.
Hi. Thank you so much for pulling all of that research together. I really appreciate that, and I will be asking for it via email. My question is, what role do you see AI playing or not playing in this, in terms of students, in chatbots having discussions or debating against an AI. Has there been anything coming out in the research that you've done, or do you have any insights into the role that you see AI playing in discussion and discourse in courses online?
Great question. I'm going to ask Bilal has something to add, and maybe at the end I'll add a little bit.
Sure. So one of the things that we found out about chatbots is that, again, it's not a new topic. Chatbots aren't new. Right now they're enabled via LLMs, but there's already a lot of research that has gone into the use of chatbots to improve learning outcomes. And the results are that it's not very effective, especially in a K-12 setting, but also for professional learning and higher ed. People aren't necessarily interested in talking to a computer. We don't have the motivation to type and talk to that machine. And even if it becomes better at responding to you, even if it becomes more human-like, as long as you have that knowledge that you're actually talking to a computer, you don't have the motivation to learn. You're not interested in being fully invested in that conversation like you would be if you were talking to a human. So I'm trying to recall the name of one of the pioneering researchers from MIT that was working on that. But one of their findings was that even with LLMs, the success is going to be very limited. And people just want to talk to other people to learn more. Social learning is still very much how we're wired to learn. That's how our brains are programmed to work. Those are some of our findings. But would you like to add anything else?
No, I was just going to add, I think from a learning design perspective, particularly, we have been thinking about conducting, again, some sort of review, right? Because there's two things, right? There is the research that has been there historically, and then there is research that is, being published left, right, and center right now with the recent advancements. And we want to be able to look at the relevance as well as the applicability of the research that is emerging just now in juxtaposition of some of the established stuff, some of the stuff that has stood the test of time, right? So that's something that it's a project that I have right now in planning stages with me. I just wanted to add that your questions are very pertinent, and somehow I feel like there is a lot of alignment in some of the things that we've been thinking about. So I just wanted to mention that that's something that it's in planning stages, that we will be working on. So would love to connect if you're interested, and yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Are there any other questions? Looks like there aren't any more questions. You can find Asad and me at Lee's booth in the sponsorship area. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Looking forward to connecting with you outside of here. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.